Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 and our talks with Walt. We now turn to the poem On Journeys Through the States. This is poem 13 of the 24 poems of inscription, and this one will connect with the poem that we just studied, To the States. And our assumptions here, and I'm hoping that we can move through these quickly, are that you've been following our stuff at LearnStrong.net. On that left-hand side, Talks with Walt. We are the stories we tell and retell, the stories, of course, we retell, and the stories as well that we decide to accept or reject. Our learning theory is also an assumption here. We are trying to always connect new old information to old information in meaningful ways. That is to say, the new, N-E-W, is the new, K-N-E-W. In other words, there's somehow a relationship. We're going to see this really powerfully in this poem on Journeys Through the States. Our annotative approach will work at level 1. What does the text say at level 2? What does the text mean? Themes, messages, 2A. Of course, the rhetorical techniques at 2B. Finally, how can I relate to this information at 3A? Other texts, and at 3B, finally, relating to self. We're going to ask about our big 5 in this poem. What can I learn about epistemology, what I can know, ontology, who I am, psychology, the study of the individual mind, sociology, we're going to see a lot of that in this poem, the study of the group mind, and then finally the question of theodicy. When bad things happen, not why did this happen to me, but rather why did this happen for me? The 5 P's are perspectives on Whitman. Whitman as person, poet, pedagogue, instructor, teacher. Whitman as politician and democracy and the celebration of that. We're going to see that a lot here. And then finally Whitman as philosopher. All of that hopefully will matter to us. Now, this is an interesting poem in terms of its background. We will have a first appearance in 1860. On our final revision in 1871. It ended up number 17 of the Chance Democratic of Leaves of Grass from the 1860 edition. This poem, however, was dropped from the 1867 edition. Then it's going to be restored in the 1871 Passage to India. Also in the Passage to India annexes of Leaves of Grass, 1872, and the 1876 two rivulets. The poet's theme is accurately conveyed in a manuscript title that he was not to use called Wanderer Teachers. This will make more sense once we actually get into the poem itself. Let's go ahead now, read the poem in exegete. On Journeys Through the States. On Journeys Through the States we start, I, through the world, urged by these songs, sailing henceforth to every land, to every sea. We, willing learners of all, teachers of all, and lovers of all. We have watched the seasons dispensing themselves and passing on, and have said, why should not a man or woman do as much as the seasons, and diffuse as much? We dwell a while in every city and town. We pass through Canada, the Northeast, the vast valley of the Mississippi, and the southern states. We confer on equal terms with each of the states. We make trial of ourselves and invite men and women to hear. We say to ourselves, remember, fear not, be candid, promulge the body and the soul. Dwell a while and pass on. Be copious, temperate, chaste, magnetic. And what you effuse may then return as the seasons return, and may be just as much as the seasons. Now, the obviously cyclical fact, that is to say the seasons play this game with us, will play heavily here. Notice where we began. Don't miss it. On Journeys takes us immediately to Homer and, of course, to the Odyssey, to Virgil, and, of course, to the Aeneid. In other words, the Greeks taught us, and the Romans taught us, that you can see life as a journey. And for those of you that love, of course, that classic little text, The Alchemist, that immediately, of course, will resonate for you as well. On Journeys Through the States, notice, just like the previous poem, this word, the States, notice, it's capitalized so that it represents, we're talking about the, of course, United States of America. Notice the vague antecedent of the pronoun we. We start. Obviously, the states or the American people. In other words, when you read Leaves of Grass, it's like taking a journey through the history of the United States. It's quite a compelling idea, right? Notice the use of the parenthetic and that American vernacular word, like almost like the fallibilist position epistemologically, like he's just coming up with an idea. Through the world, urged by these songs. Now, I've told you already, this word urge is a primary word of Leaves of Grass. It's like the creation impulse, right? That is to say, we're pushed, we're challenged in some way. Notice Sailing, one of the compelling word pictures of Leaves of Grass. Henceforth, and then notice the repetition of the word every. To every land, to every sea. Many have pointed out that while Whitman loves to talk about the American states, he also loves to talk about the state of all the world. And notice all lands, all seas. Pretty soon Whitman will be, kind of embraced by all countries. We, notice we're back to this same pronoun, we willing learners of all. We're messing around now with Whitman's pedagogy, his understanding of education. We, willing here, willing meaning excited, curious learners, right? Of all, teachers of all, lovers of all. Notice the three there, the Trinity, right, of three of those, right? And of course, loving is the key to all learning. Whitman is going to argue, not just here, but elsewhere as well, right? This idea that we have to continue to aspire to more learning. We have, and then notice the elided verb here of watched, to try and capture some of that American vernacular, right? We have watched the seasons dispensing themselves and passing on. Now, of course, you can think of Shelley's Ode to the West Wind. You can think of any number of other romantic texts that will play that game of the seasons as giving us some idea. What is it Shelley says at the conclusion of Ode to the West Wind? If winter come, can spring be far behind? Obviously, Whitman's passion and love for Shelley is going to play out in this one, right? We have watched the seasons dispensing themselves and passing on. Think of Emerson and his classic essay Circles here. Think of Thoreau and some of those greatest passages when he talks about moving from spring to summer to winter and then, of course, back to spring. And have said, notice here, the absence of the quotation marks, why should not a man or woman do as much as the seasons and effuse as much? In other words, we're here playing around with this key word of effusion, this idea of producing in some powerful way. And notice the rhetorical question. In other words, if seasons produce, why can't nations produce new fruit in the spring, we might say, right? Notice we continue. We dwell a while. We're just a short period of time. We'll play the game here again when we meet Whitman's pedagogic view in Song of Myself, passage 46, 47, the Destroy the Teacher passage. We dwell a while in every city and town. Whitman's inclusivity. Put it in your notes. It's really important. Whitman is a great inclusivist thinker. He's going to enjoin all of us. We pass through, notice the spelling of Canada. This will be the way that he will spell Canada all the way through Leaves of Grass. And in many ways, it is just an idiosyncratic way to spell. I mean, it's just Whitman, right? Using the K instead of the C. We pass through Canada, the Northeast, the vast valley of the Mississippi, something he knew a bit about because he had his trip down to New Orleans. The southern states. Notice what's missing here is the West. Did you see this, right? Although we understand that, of course, he's giving all different parts of the United States, so it's kind of subsumed there, right? We confer on equal terms. Notice the word equal here to emphasize, again, the inclusivity. Confer meaning to think together. With each of the states, we make trial of ourselves. Now, this is a significant idea, this use of this word trial. Think of it this way. There was a president who stood and said, 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, and then he used the word, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. And go back to the word again. We make trial, test. Whitman was a great lover of Lincoln. He was very impressioned by lines from the Gettysburg Address. And here, he's playing the same game. In other words, there's a kind of test or a kind of trial that is understood to be fundamentally American. So we make trial of ourselves and invite the invitation, obviously the invocation, the invitation here at the beginning of Leaves of Grass, and invite men and women to hear. By the way, notice, men and women. In other words, for Whitman, very inclusive. We say to ourselves, by the way, this is the 8th we, if you want to start counting these, right? So notice the mantra, the repetition, right? We, that idea of unifying as a poet. We say to ourselves, and again, no quotation marks here, right? Remember, the only sin is to forget, one of the great Whitman ideas. In other words, that need to hold on to the things that matter. Remember, what's our next important bit of instruction? fear not. This takes us back to the States, and of course, resist much, obey little, right? Be candid. Now think about the way that the word candid gets used in the Declaration of Independence. Let facts be submitted to a candid world, is the way Tom Jefferson wrote it. Candid here, in other words, be authentic, be honest. Promulge, the archaic variant of promulgate, right? Okay, promulge the body and the soul. Passage 48 of Song of Myself will come back. I have said that the soul is not more than the body, and I have said that the body is not more than the soul. And nothing is greater to oneself than is greater to oneself than oneself. Not even God. This idea of body and soul must come together in one kind of unifying whole. Then what are we going to do? Well, we're going to dwell a while, and then we're going to pass on. In other words, we're not here for a long time. We got to be copious, that is to say, abundant. Generous might be our word here. We got to be temperate. Think about our 4 virtues of Plato from the Republic. Wisdom, you'll remember. Courage. Temperance is the 3rd one, right? And discipline is the way we sometimes translate it. And then finally, justice itself. Chaste. Now this is going to be an interesting one, right? In terms of Whitman's own sexual understandings, right? This word chaste, in other words, you're circumspect, we might say. And then this key word from Leaves of Grass, magnetic. In other words, it's about energy. There's a certain kind of energy. He'll talk about this in Song of the Open Road. Why is it when I walk under a certain tree, I'm never the same afterwards? This notion of magnetic. And what you effuse, notice again we're back to a word used earlier in the poem, may then return as the seasons return. And may, notice again here his fallibilist epistemological position, may be just, again, justice, Plato's Republic coming to mind, as much as the seasons. In other words, there is this notion that it's very possible that nations can be abundant in the same way that spring provides a certain kind of dynamic growth. And there it is. So let's finish now at 2a. Well, the growth of America, obviously like the seasons. And then, of course, the idea that we're all Americans. Whitman's inclusivity is profound in this poem. But we're testing ourselves constantly as a nation. At 2b, the power of the vague antecedent, of course, the anaphoria of all those we's there, as well as notice the spelling of Canada. At 3a, well, we began with journeys, right? So we have to think about Homer's Odyssey, Virgil's Aeneid comes to mind, the power of journeys and Dante's Divine Comedy. I also want to point out, and just set it up for you later, that Passage to India, now I'm not talking about Ian Forster's classic novel, but rather the poem by Whitman, Passage to India, is one that we've got to study with that same notion of profound inclusivity. I've mentioned Emerson's Circles, obviously Plato's Republic and the cardinal virtues are all there. Finally, at 3b, to try and own this type of idea, what are your thoughts about this one? Do you think nations have seasons? And if so, where is your nation now? Is it in the summer? Is it in the fall? Is it in the winter? Is it in the spring? How about this one? Do you think your life is like a season? And if so, where are you now in that season of your life? Right? Finally, of all of the virtues, and we listed quite a few here in this poem, which do you think is the most important and why? Like, what is it for you that's most profound as you think about being a willing learner, a student who is willing to be tested and sees the advantage of the test, quite frankly? Well, I hope that our talks with Walt will continue to challenge, test you. Thank you.